At 06:18 on October 14, 1942, Corporal Thomas Riley crouched beneath the shattered catapult housing on USS Larkspur, watching sparks lick the dawn. He was 24 years old. He smelled burned oil and sea salt. The carrier rolled. Men shouted above him. A storm had bent steel like paper. The flight deck had a jagged bite taken out of it. Planes were lined nose to tail, 80 of them. Engines idling, pilots waiting. Riley's hands were black. His fingers trembled. He knew the catapult would not fire clean. He knew the arresting gear might not catch a returning wildcat. He knew the Admiral wanted that strike launched at first light. Someone had to make the machine behave. Someone had to keep 80 men from dying in seconds. Riley had no rank to give orders. He had tools and a stubborn jaw. He had a secret fix. He had 10 minutes. The deck groaned. The sun rose. He tightened a coil of piano wire and thought, if this fails, they all die. Why had the ship been sent out like this? The question burned hotter than the engine smoke. Why had the Admiral ordered a full strike from a damaged carrier? That was the mystery he couldn't shake. Corporal Thomas Patrick Riley was 24. He was from Red Hook, Brooklyn. He had a stooped walk from carrying crates as a boy. He'd learned to wrench under cold street lamps and under a grandfather's battered car. He'd learned to swear quietly and fix things that other men called broken. Before the war, he worked nights at a marine engine shop. He dated a seamstress named Lillian. He liked coffee thick as black paint. He could strip a Pratt Whitney in 30 minutes. He could tell a bolt story by its rust. He'd shipped out with a faded photograph of Lillian tucked under his toolbox. He had joined the Navy because the draft took his friends. He had enlisted as an aviation machinist's mate. He spent nights patching engine mounts and days, oiling propellers. He liked the smell of fuel and the way a well-tuned engine sang. He hated the smell of formal inspections. He respected metal more than paperwork. He'd been aboard USS Larkspur for 6 months. He'd seen one carrier take a bomb through the bow and keep sailing. He'd seen a wildcat spin out on takeoff. He'd seen men laugh at the mess table and then vanish from morning roll call. He'd watched pilots become ghosts. He had not shot at the enemy. He had kept planes flying. That, he believed, mattered. There had been rumors on board. The ship had left Pearl with a patchwork crew and a deck with weak spots. They had been ordered into a fast-moving operation to support ground forces. The Admiral had decided to press the attack despite the damage. Radios were full of conflicting messages. The engineering log said, within acceptable limits. The deck officer said, proceed. Riley read the log and felt a cold squeeze in his chest. Numbers on paper did not save men. Wrenches did. The first name to leave a hole in the crew's laughter was Petty Officer Second Class Harold Hal Monroe. He was 26. He had come from Dayton, Ohio. He was a calm man with grease under his fingernails and a knack for rigging a radio aerial from anything. On September 3, 1942, Hal had crawled under a Douglas Dauntless to repair a jammed firing solenoid. The plane caught a sudden gust, rolled off the elevator, and the propeller took his leg. He bled out. Before the corpsman could stitch him together. Hal's last words were about a joke he could not finish. Riley had found Hal's wallet later, with a ticket home and a small penciled map of his sister's street. Riley couldn't stop thinking how the map had been more real than the logbook. He tightened his jaw and tightened bolts with both hands. The second was Ensign Peter Collins, 21, Paterson, New Jersey, a pilot who had once visited Riley's engine shop and insisted on buying the mechanic's coffee. He'd been lighter than most officers, and he kept a small brass harmonica in his flight jacket. On September 16th, Collins's Wildcat stalled on a takeoff run when the catapult shuddered. He tried to lift, but the plane rocked, struck the deck's jagged rail, and cartwheeled into the sea. A witness said Collins's harmonica clattered out of his jacket like a small bright thing. Riley hid the harmonica. He could not return it. He had seen how easily sound could be cut off. Both deaths landed like metal against the hull. They were not numbers. They were places. Hal's home, Collins's harmonica. 2 funerals on deck, the flag folded, a whistle blown into a wind that smelled of burnt oil. Each name changed Riley's hands. He stopped thinking in hours and began thinking in bolts. He began to notice a small delay in the catapult, the way it hesitated when the hydraulic cylinder caught a burp of trapped air. It was a fraction of a second. It was a cruel fraction. That fraction had a throat. The PW catapult on Larkspur was old. The carrier had been patched and patched again. The catapult launch mechanism relied on timing and tension. A burst of hydraulic pressure would snap a shuttle, the plane's launch bar would ride a track, and the aircraft would be flung into the sky. If the timing was off, the plane could yaw, stall, or slam into the deck. If the arresting gear failed on return, and the plane would slide into parked aircraft and spread the damage like fire. Mechanics called the odd delay the hiccup. It was an engineering curse. Explained plainly, the catapult cylinder would build pressure, hesitate a sliver, then catch. That sliver meant the shuttle's acceleration curve changed. A pilot expecting a clean pull would find the nose lifting too late. The aircraft would present too high an angle or too slow a roll rate. In combat, that small misbehavior could be lethal. A wildcat that yawed, left before clearing the deck, could strike the island. A Dauntless with a late pull could bottom out and lose a wing. Riley had watched the data. The watch officer called it within tolerances. The men called it killing. Why would officials not fix it? Because within specifications smelled like a bureaucratic shield. The ship's engineering reports were full of proper phrases. No structural compromise. Components operating within specified tolerances. The yard notes said the catapult required a full rebuild, which meant dry dock, weeks offline, and a fleet commander who refused to wait. War did not stop for repairs. Commanders made cruel arithmetic. There were too many ships needed for too few days. The admiral's orders emphasized tempo. Riley saw that tempo written in brass on the captain's chest. The captain wanted strikes launched to blunt the enemy's advances. No one wanted to delay a mission for paperwork. Warranty issues mattered on paper. Contracts, parts lists, and manufacturing tolerances whispered the same thing. We didn't design for this. Field modifications were not authorized. If a mechanic broke procedure, he risked court-martial. If a commander accepted an unauthorized fix, he risked blame in the event of a disaster. The deck officers preferred rules to blame. The engineers preferred to send a report. The pilots preferred to fly. Riley preferred not to bury his friends. There was no official channel for the kind of fix he saw in his head. The fix, in Riley's mind, was a simple physics tweak. The catapult's shuttle needed a more consistent acceleration profile. A small timing cam could smooth the pressure surge gauge. A tension brace could remove microflex in the launch track. The materials were simple: piano wire, a snatch of engine spring, a battered bracket. It was not on any list. It was not sanctioned by any manual. It would not appear in a logbook unless someone wrote it there. Then the third death made rules irrelevant. Lieutenant, junior grade, Charles Charlie Hayes was 28, from Des Moines, Iowa. Hayes had been a farm kid who could fix a tractor blindfolded. He had the grin of someone who believed he'd come out of every scrape. On October 2, 1942, Hayes prepared for a bombing run to support troops ashore. That morning the deck was slick with rain. The catapult shuddered as Hayes' Corsair rolled into position. Radio chatter described wind shear, tanking fuel lines, the distant hum of enemy fighters. 0913, Hayes ready, the pilot called. Copy, came the voice from the bridge. There was the familiar hiccup. The shuttle grabbed, then hesitated. Hayes felt the plane pitch forward. He yanked up to clear the bow. The Corsair's prop dug into a pond of water on the deck edge. The nose caught and the plane pitched, struck the forward barrier, and broke apart in a wash of bright metal and screaming fuel. The on-deck witness radioed, "Mayday! Plane down!" The sea swallowed Hayes and the Corsair in a second. Rescue crews splashed and dove, but the oil burned hot. By the time they brought Hayes in on a raft, he had drowned under the weight of the plane. He was dead before they hoisted him aboard. Riley sat 3 feet away. He had watched Hayes laugh while tightening his helmet strap. He had passed him a cigarette the week before. He had told Hayes a joke that went nowhere. The Admiral ordered more patrols. The log said mishap due to deck conditions. But Riley knew. He had felt the shuttle, as hesitation with his own hands when he inspected it. The delay had a face. It had a throat. It was killing them. The tally started to look like a pattern. 37 aircraft from similar carriers had been lost around the theater in the previous 6 weeks, the rumors said. The names were stitched into Riley's memory. Hal Monroe, Peter Collins, Charlie Hayes. Each was a person with a hometown and a mother who expected letters. Each loss piled pressure on men already tired. Riley could see the pattern in the way pilots avoided the port side at night, in the way engine crews refused to sign off on launches. He could see the paperwork piling up in neat columns. He could see the captain's eyes when he spoke of mission necessity. Riley studied diagrams. He talked quietly with 2 other machinists, Luis Mendez from San Antonio and Joe Gunner McCaffrey from Boston. They met in the ship's shadowed bow, where tools clinked like a private language. "If we rig a cam to this timing rod," Luis whispered, "we smooth out the kink." Gunner nodded so hard his cigarette fell. "If it snaps, we go down with it," he said. They knew the risk. They also knew the horror of another morning with pilots lined and engines screaming and men cartwheeling into the sea. Riley felt a heat behind his ribs. If the captain would not authorize a field alteration, someone would have to do it without permission. The final straw came just before dawn on October 13th. The ship had been ordered to launch a strike at 0742 to intercept an enemy convoy. A scout had spotted transports and a carrier escort headed straight for the Allied line. The Admiral wanted planes in the air at sunrise. The engineering report said repairs could be carried out in 12 hours. The Admiral wanted no delay. Hayes, before his death, had asked Riley a quiet thing in the engine shop. "Tom," he said, thumb tracing a scratch on a wrench, "if there's anything you can do, tell me." He was smiling because pilots always joked to hide fear. Riley had no words then. After Hayes died, the echoes of that question rattled. Riley felt the weight like a hand on his back. He thought of Lillian's laugh. He thought of Hal's penciled map. He thought of a harmonica clattering into the sea like a bright thing. The responsibility pressed, not in commands from above, but in the faces of men who trusted him to make metal behave. At 0340, Riley met Luis and Gunner under the tilted flight deck with oil lamps and welding goggles. They had 6 minutes to get parts and scavenge springs. They had to be unseen by the deck officer and the sentry at the forward ladder. Riley felt the risk as a live wire. If they were caught, they could be charged. The captain could order a court-martial. The Admiral could blame them for a failed launch. "But Hayes was going to die if we didn't do something," Riley said. The words were the wedge that broke his hesitation. They nodded. None of them slept. None of them wanted to bury another man because paperwork mattered more than life. They had a choice: obey and watch men die, or break the rules and risk everything for the chance to save them. Riley's hands, which had tightened bolts for years, tightened around a coil of piano wire. The modification scene was a slow-motion storm. It was midnight and late-night watch were few. Metal gleamed in the lamp. Riley's hands shook. He set a small bench near the catapult housing. He described the plan in clipped sentences, all of which had to be exact. They would fashion a microcam from a scrap bracket. They would use a 6-inch piece of piano wire as a tensioning brace. They would take a spring from a flak gun housing and lay a notch to smooth the shuttle's catch. The goal, a gentler, faster acceleration curve that removed the hiccup. The material list was humble. The stakes were enormous. They had 8 minutes to install the brace before the ship's routine checks would alert an officer. Riley's palms were slick. He filed metal until his fingers ached. Sparks fell like tiny stars. He could hear the men on deck laughing somewhere, unaware of the surgery beneath their feet. His breath came in the sound of the ship. He wedged the wire, tightened a clamp, and wrapped the cam to the timing rod. The piano wire hummed as he bent it. The bracket bit into place. Gunner muttered a prayer he didn't mean. Luis wiped his brow with the back of his hand. At one point the wire snapped free and lashed Riley's knuckle. He felt hot blood and hot anger. He whispered, "Not now." He rethreaded the brace and swore with a quiet ferocity. The clock in his head ticked. If it failed, Hayes would be dead again. If it worked, a dozen lives might change. He thought about Lillian and how she would fold his letter into thin squares. He thought about Hal's wallet. He thought about the captain's polished boots and breathing them in like inevitability. They completed the installation in 8 minutes and 32 seconds. It was not pretty. It was not sanctioned. It was held together by sweat and stubbornness. Riley marked the clamp with a small notch only he and Luis would recognize. Then they cleaned their hands and went back to the mess like nothing had happened. No one looked at the catapult. They had crossed the point of no return. At 07:42, Hayes taxis. The deck smells of hydraulic oil and hot metal. Pilots strap in. The admiral paces. The carrier hums. The formation is 6 divisions strong. Target, convoy at bearing 043, 20 miles out. The plan, hit transports hard and break their escort. Intelligence says Lig height. Fighters will try to intercept. The sky is thin with cloud. The sea is a sheet. 742, Hayes engines hot. The radio crackles. Copy? The bridge answers. Your go. Hayes thumbs the throttle. He rolls. The shuttle grabs. Riley watches from the island, pretending to file a panel. He feels the deck under his boots. He wants to shout and freeze at the same time. The catapult pulls. The cam bites. There is no hiccup. The shuttle accelerates with a clean curve. The Corsair lifts. Hayes's plane responds instantly. No lag, no yaw. He clears the bow. He screams a single word into the wind. The plane disappears into the dawn like a bird made of chrome. Riley exhales and then slams his fist into his palm so no one sees. At 08:14, the engagement starts. Enemy fighters climb to intercept. The first waves of Wildcats and Dauntless make runs at the convoy. Riley's fingers ache with waiting. The ship lists as planes launch. Radios pop with tension. Enemy fighters at 08 Sun Seas, reports a scout. The formation tightens. The sky becomes a web. Pilots call their positions in short bursts. First contact. 3 zeros peel from cloud at 08:18 and dive. The Wildcats hold formation and make a defensive spread. Hayes lines up behind a 0. He rides his throttle. The modified catapult meant nothing now. It was only a chance. Combat is chaos, not charity. The first shot misses. The zeros tumble and turn like fish. Hayes feels the Corsair respond instantly when he banks. The plane snaps. It obeys him. He thinks for a moment of Lillian's laugh. He fires. Rounds walk up the Zero's fuselage. The enemy plane burns and falls away. The first kill is close and intimate. Hayes breaks inside the enemy's turn. The Corsair's control surfaces bite. He eases the stick. The G's press every bone. The sound is a thin keening. Tracers stitch the sky into a lattice. He holds the trigger. The Zero's cockpit erupts. Landesis. Pilot does not have time to cry. The plane spins and slides into the sea. Hayes radios, voice flat. One down, heading to target. His hands are steady. Riley's chest roars like an engine. He believes. The captain smiles almost without noticing. The second engagement follows like a drumbeat. Enemy fighters reorganize and dive again at 0827. This time the Wildcats meet them head-on. Hayes finds a seam. He tears into the black. The plane responds with a snap. He lines up another pass and watches the enemy plane disintegrate. The kills are not trophies. They are survival. The squadron takes a clip each, then peels to rearm over the water. The battle cycles in short bursts. The modified launch is invisible now. It is only in the pilot's hands and in the way planes no longer stalled on the rail. Riley hears the return radio. 3 bandits at 0834 diverting. Pilots change tactics. They fly low to avoid flak. The convoy opens fire with machine guns. Splinters fly like rain. Wildcat pilots count seconds like prayer beads. Hayes calls for a second pass. He drops bombs. The transports shudder and start to list. Fires bloom on one hull. Men in the water are tiny dots being swallowed by oil. The deck crew below hears a roar and counts 1, 2, 3, as planes that had left return with black stripes of victory and single missing parts. Every time Hayes reverses or tucks, the P-38-like responsiveness of his Corsair gives him the edge. The modification gave the launch a promise, and the pilot made it real. Riley watches through binoculars. He is not in the sky. He is on the deck. He imagines the pilot's hands and the feel of the throttle. He watches as Hayes radios, "I got 2, coming home." The voice is thin. It is alive. Riley feels as if the world could tilt and keep these men within its arms. There is a third kill. It is quiet and sudden. At 0902, a Japanese escort fighter tries to slip behind the formation and pick off stragglers. Hayes and another pilot, Lieutenant Morgan, notice the movement. They dive like a pair of hawks. Hayes catches the enemy in the sun. The enemy tries to roll. Hayes rolls faster. The Corsair snaps into the turn. The plane obeys like a willing beast. He squeezes the trigger. The enemy plane brakes and slides away in a plume of smoke. The kill is clean. The men who survive will tell the story later with shorter sentences and harder eyes. Return to base. 10:46, October 14th. Planes begin to report back, some limping, some whole. The ship rocks as the last of the 20 aircraft rejoin the deck. Riley's legs feel like jelly. He stands at the island and waits. He hears the thud of wheels, the hiss of brakes, the shriek of cables catching hook. The arresting gear takes the planes without another snapped cable. The deck does not betray them. The pilots climb from cockpits, smiling and exhausted. Hayes steps off his Corsair at 10:52, removes his helmet and leans against the railing. He smiles at Riley and says 2 words that make Riley's hands forget to shake. It worked. Riley's hands are wet with oil. He hears the crackle of the radio and the captain's hoarse voice. The admiral thanks the squadron. The logs will later record effective strike. The men will later say, "We were lucky." Riley knows it was not luck. He had the small, bitter knowledge that his hands and a coil of wire had tilted the day. Relief pours through him. The tension in his shoulders unwinds like a snapped rope. He feels vindicated and guilty at once. He had broken the rules, but the men were alive. Hayes lived. He would fly more missions. He would come back to Iowa. The cost had been measured in seconds and might have been measured in lives, other pilots noticed. By October, Air 16th, 6 other pilots had watched from altitude when Hayes's Corsair lifted clean. They told each other in the mess. "Something was different about his airplane," one said. The words passed like a secret handshake. Quiet requests began to appear in toolboxes. "Tom, can you look at my plane?" Riley pretended not to notice. He lied to the supply officer about extra spring requisitions and smiled when called into briefings. He did not tell the captain. He could not. The fix was illegal in the eyes of regulations. It was a private salvation, like water shared in a desert. Mechanics began to whisper and copy the notch. Gunner showed a marine mechanic a small notch near the timing rod and said nothing. Luis scrawled crude diagrams in grease on a packing crate and let other machinists read them. Word spread unofficially like oil. By August, the men joked in the same breath, but here we are in October. By October 20th, Riley had modified 9 aircraft himself, and other enlisted men had adopted similar tweaks. They did the work in the dark hours between patrols. They used piano wire, engine springs, and the same crude cam idea. No one documented them openly. The modifications were scratches and notches that lived in the shadows of the flight log. The results multiplied. Planes that once yawed on takeoff now leapt. Return landings were less likely to skip. The squadron's mission success rate climbed. Pilots began to fly with a different confidence. They took tighter formations and riskier intercepts. Casualty numbers, which had been a constant worry, dipped subtly. The men started to count in names again rather than numbers. Riley kept a tiny folded list in his watch pocket. Names and dates, and a single word next to each. Fixed. He never told Lillian about it. He feared she would not understand the small dishonesty required of survival. Specific examples multiplied with names. Lieutenant Morgan, 29, San Diego, said his engine felt like somebody had tuned it just for you. Corporal Pete Alvarez, 22, from El Paso, who had nearly stalled his plane on a launch 3 months before, returned from a patrol with that grin like the world owes me a favor. The tally shifted. Missions that had looked like desperate gambles now looked like calculated strikes. Riley began to think in names and saved faces. He imagined how many mothers would not get telegrams. He imagined how many small towns would not be cut clean by grief. That image was fiercer than any reprimand. From the enemy's perspective, something changed too. Pilots in the Japanese and escort squadrons could not name a mechanical tweak. They could only feel a new edge to the opposition. Reports filtered back in fractured whispers. The Americans are flying different. Enemy commanders noticed tactics that had worked no longer did. Where they once turned and pressured, they found pilots clinging and cutting. There was confusion. Fighter captains recorded the sensation of being surprised by quick responses and tighter formations. They wrote about unnatural aggressiveness from American squadrons. They guessed at better training or new aircraft. They did not know about a notch of piano wire and a coil of spring hidden in a catapult housing. They called it something changed. The official discovery happened the way secret things are discovered, through a small mistake. A supply officer, anxious about missing parts, asked for the unusual spring requisitions. A clerk flagged the form. An engineering officer traced the pattern back to an unlogged alteration on the catapult housing. An audit started. At first there was fury. Unauthorized modification burned like acid through memos. A surface flotilla inspector demanded an investigation. Engineers came aboard, measured, and tested, and frowned. The captain was called to the bridge for a private conversation with the admiral. Riley watched them through a porthole and felt a small private dread. He expected a drumbeat of courts-martial. What happened instead was the impossible dilemma of war. The tests came back. Engineering found the modification had smoothed the shuttle's acceleration and reduced the failure mode. In technical language, the cam reduced micro-surge and equalized cable tension, reducing the probability of takeoff stalls by an appreciable margin under the operating conditions. In plain language, men lived who would have died. The engineering team could recommend a field retrofit or wait for the manufacturer. The admiral had to choose between public discipline and operational necessity. He chose necessity. Initial fury softened into a reluctant acceptance. The fix was not written into manuals, but engineers recommended the change be implemented across the fleet where needed. The notion of quiet acceptance spread upwards like a hand offered in the dark. The captain stopped asking questions about missing springs. The admiral stopped talking about court-martial. Men who had been silent now had small, private nods of recognition. Riley and the others remained uncredited in any official report. Their names did not appear in the engineering bulletin. The world that mattered to Riley was the one where pilots came home. The rest was small. Official evaluation followed. An engineering team from the fleet arrived and ran tests. They disassembled the cam and the brace while the sailors waited. They ran the catapult through calibration cycles. They re-gunned the tension rods and measured the pressure curves. Riley watched from a distance. He ate a slice of bread with coffee and pretended to be indifferent. The engineers reported, "The modification is safe and effective within operational parameters." They wrote recommendations in precise language. Age, field adaptability confirmed. Recommended for fleet retrofit, subject to supply. They noted the makeshift parts and the risks, and still could not deny the result. Engineers said what mechanics had said with less profanity and more charts. They admitted the initial design allowed a micro-pressure oscillation that the field environment amplified. They noted that factory tolerances had not accounted for persistent deck flexing in heavy seas. They recommended design changes that would take months in yards. They recommended a short-term retrofit across forward carriers. The admiral nodded and signed the order quietly. The retrofit was integrated into later maintenance cycles. It was folded into supply lists with a different name and a new part number. Officially, the improvement was Procedural Adjustment 42B. Privately, some engineers looked at the notched clamp and smiled like men who had found a secret. The protagonist's name did not appear in the official docket. There was no plaque installed in a dry dock. The men who had done the work remained enlisted and low rank. Riley returned to his bench and continued to oil pistons. He would not tell the full story in reports. He would not put his name to an act that might have been punished. He kept the small notch and a scrap of piano wire in his locker as proof for himself. The Admiral's bulletin credited mechanical refinement by fleet engineering. That phrasing had enough room for everyone to stay alive, and for no single man to be blamed or honored. It was safe. It was cowardly. It was also how this war moved sometimes. Fleet-wide adoption happened quietly. Squadrons that had been patched with the retrofit reported fewer launch incidents and fewer stalls. The statistics shifted across months. Where losses had spiked with deck damage, they now flattened. Men who had once feared a launch pulled with a steadier hand. Riley would later estimate, when he allowed himself to count, that between 80 and 100 American pilots whose sorties touched those carriers, likely saved from immediate catastrophic failure by the change. He never wrote it down. He never said it loud. The numbers lived in his head like a private ledger. He imagined mothers receiving letters instead of telegrams. He imagined Lillian's hands stitching dresses in a kitchen that might now stay full of laughter. How many missions did Hayes fly after that day? He flew 63 missions in total. He lived. He collected 11 confirmed kills. He returned to Iowa after the war and ran a small auto shop. He married Lillian and kept his hands busy with engines, and with a life that had been messy and lucky. Riley withheld some details at Hayes' homecoming party. He let Hayes tell the stories and laugh with the other men. He never told Hayes that a coil of piano wire had once been the difference between his thumbprint and his tombstone. Hayes did not ask. He trusted men who fixed engines. Riley survived the war. He was discharged with calloused hands and a small limp from a ladder fall. He returned to Brooklyn, to a room above a bakery where the smell of yeast felt like an apology. He worked as a mechanic and married Lillian in a church with a cracked bell. He never wrote to the Navy asking for credit. He kept the scrap of piano wire in his pocket until it disintegrated. Once, at a reunion, an engineer who had signed the fleet retrofit shook his hand and said, "We owe you." Riley shrugged. He made a joke that landed like gravel. He did not expect medals. He expected Saturday work and a steady paycheck and a small life stitched quiet. The long-term impact was harder to quantify. Fleet readiness increased. Pilots who would have been lost were not. Entire missions that depended on carrier strikes were executed with higher consistency. Tactics adapted. Carriers could commit to larger, riskier strikes if engineers could patch hazards quickly. The strategic effect reshaped led past single names. Convoys were broken up. Supply lines were interrupted. Men ashore received supplies they might not have had. Sailors in the ships that adopted the fix learned a different kind of confidence, one that came from knowing someone had worked in the dark to make them whole. Riley later estimated the human tally, quietly and roughly. Between 80 and 100 pilots' lives were likely spared immediate catastrophic failure because of the retrofit and its unofficial spread. That number hovered in his head like a soft bell. He could not prove it. He did not need to. The faces that came to mind were not statistics. They were Hal's penciled map, Collins's harmonica, and Hayes's grin. Those were proof enough. He had saved people without permission. He had broken rules and broken the cycle of death for a handful of men. That was the ledger he kept. Years later, Tom Riley sat at a small table in a diner and drank coffee that tasted of tin. He kept a postcard from Lillian on his workbench and a photograph of a carrier group in a frame above his stove. He taught apprentices to look at parts and ask what they did and why. If a young mechanic asked him why he'd risk a court-martial, he would say with a short laugh, "You don't always ask permission to stop a man from dying." He meant it. He kept his language plain. He did not romanticize the choice. It had been messy. It had been necessary. Historians found the story later. In 1967, a naval historian combing through after-action reports noticed an anomaly in maintenance requisitions and in a fleet engineering bulletin. He traced the bulletin's language and found references to Procedural Adjustment 42B and some handwritten notes that did not appear in the official log. He tracked down men who had served on USS Larkspur and heard pieces of the story, snatches of the notch, the name Tom, a harmonica at the bottom of a trunk. He published a small article. Riley was interviewed with surprise and awkwardness. He said little. He preferred to listen. The historian wrote that an enlisted machinist had saved pilots by improvising a field fix. The article called it a small but decisive action. Riley read it and felt embarrassed by the word decisive. He thought of Hal and Collins and Hayes and did not feel decisive. He felt tired. He felt alive. That is how invention happens in war. Not in committees and contracts, not always in polished briefings. It happens in grease and late-night lamps. It happens where a corporal sees an ugly truth and decides to make something better with what he finds. The story is not a neat moral. It is a messy testament to people who make choices that are not sanctioned but are humane. Riley's work was part of a broader truth, that ingenuity often rises from necessity and from the quiet courage of those who stand under humming steel and refuse to step back. Final image. A faded photograph of Hayes and Riley on a pier after the war, the carrier in the background and their faces full of salt and light. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. If you found this story compelling, please like. Subscribe to stay connected. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. If this story moved you, share it, and keep the names of those who fixed the world in the small, stubborn notebooks of memory.